Number 9. The sound on the far side of the moon. Apollo 10 launched on May 18, 1969, carrying Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan on a full dress rehearsal for the moon landing that would follow 2 months later. As the spacecraft passed behind the moon, cut off from any radio contact with Houston, the crew heard a rising and falling whistling tone through their headsets, something none of them could place. Stafford and Cernan both confirmed hearing it independently. The full transcript of the exchange was technically available to researchers as early as 1973, but it stayed obscure for decades until footage of the recording resurfaced publicly around 2008 and again in 2016. NASA's working explanation is that the sound came from interference between the separate VHF radios on the lunar module and the command module, two systems operating close together with nothing to isolate the signal. The crew of Apollo 11 was warned about the sound in advance, so it wouldn't catch them off guard 2 months later. Even now, no complete engineering log has ever been published showing exactly how that interference pattern produced a tone stable enough to sound to 3 trained test pilots like music. Number 8. The object over Hawaii. On June 4, 1965, 1 day into the Gemini 4 mission, command pilot James McDivitt was alone in the capsule while his crewmate Ed White slept. Passing over Hawaii with the control engines shut down, McDivitt reported an object appearing in his window, a white cylindrical shape with what he described as a long arm or antenna sticking out from one side. He photographed it, though the resulting images were never sharp enough to resolve the object's structure. Interviewed years later by the Air Force's Condon Committee, McDivitt compared its outline to the discarded second stage of a Titan rocket. NASA and outside investigators floated a spent booster or a classified reconnaissance satellite as explanations, but neither NORAD nor NASA ever produced tracking data placing a known object at McDivitt's position at that exact moment. With no second witness and no corroborating radar track, the sighting has remained, in the words of independent researchers who reviewed the case decades later, one of the few astronaut reports never adequately closed out. Number 7. The lights over the Indian Ocean. On September 15, 1991, 5 days into its mission, the Space Shuttle Discovery was orbiting roughly 350 miles above Earth when its payload bay camera, aimed toward the dark horizon during a mission designated STS-48, recorded a sequence that has been studied for over 3 decades. Several bright objects drift across the frame, then a flash of light appears, and one object executes a sharp course change and accelerates away. NASA's official position attributes the objects to ice particles reacting to the firing of the shuttle's reaction control system thrusters, small jets used to adjust orientation, whose exhaust plumes can push nearby debris. Independent analysts who later ran frame-by-frame digital tracking on the footage found the objects following curved, non-ballistic paths and reported that some appeared to move upward from Earth's limb rather than away from the shuttle's hull. No public release of the exact thruster firing timeline for that 10-minute window has ever settled the kinematic dispute either way. Number 6. The shape that changed. On May 5, 1981, aboard the Soviet space station Salyut 6, cosmonaut Vladimir Kovalyonok was finishing a set of exercises when he looked through a porthole while the station was passing over South Africa toward the Indian Ocean. He described an elliptical object flying in formation with the station, close enough to study its outline. As he watched, the object appeared to turn transparent, revealing what looked like an internal structure, then split apart into 2 connected spheres joined by a thin line before both faded from view. American space analyst James Oberg later proposed that translucent, expanding rocket exhaust plumes, which behave strangely once they billow out above 100 kilometers into vacuum, could account for a shape-shifting light. Kovalyonok maintained for years afterward that nothing about the timing matched any known launch he was later shown.
Number 5. The flashes inside their own eyes. Beginning with Apollo 11 in 1969, astronauts adapting to total darkness inside their spacecraft began reporting streaks and pinpoints of light crossing their vision with their eyes closed. No external light source anywhere nearby. The cause turned out to be cosmic rays, heavy, high-energy atomic nuclei, called HZE particles for their high atomic number and energy, that pass straight through a spacecraft's hull and through the human eye itself. When one of these particles crosses the retina, it can ionize the tissue directly, or trigger Cherenkov radiation, a genuine burst of light produced when a charged particle moves through the eye's fluid faster than light itself travels in that medium. On Apollo 17 in December 1972, Gene Cernan, Ron Evans, and Harrison Schmitt wore a detector that logged 17 flashes during a single session. Several matched precisely to heavy nuclei striking the eye. Astronauts on the International Space Station report the identical sensation today. More than 50 years after Aldrin first mentioned it, the exact biophysical step between a particle's impact and a perceived point of light is still not fully resolved. Number 4. The lightning that reaches space? On September 8, 2015, European Space Agency astronaut Andreas Mogensen was floating in the International Space Station's observation cupola over the Bay of Bengal when he noticed a violent thunderstorm developing below and began filming. Over 160 seconds, his camera recorded 245 brief blue discharges rippling across the storm's cloud tops, one of which shot upward into the stratosphere as a pulsating blue jet reaching roughly 25 miles above sea level, a type of transient luminous event triggered by extreme electrical activity inside the storm. Weeks earlier, in August, astronauts had also photographed red sprites, a related upper atmosphere discharge stretching some 60 miles high above two separate storms in the American Midwest and off El Salvador, within 3 minutes of each other. Ordinary clouds block these events from ground observers almost entirely, which is why, despite decades of pilot and ground reports, this was the first time either phenomenon had been captured on video in this much detail. The European Space Agency added a permanent instrument, the Atmosphere-Space Interactions Monitor, to the station's exterior in 2018, specifically to keep watching for them. Number 3. The debriefing released 57 years later. On July 31, 1969, 10 days after splashdown, Apollo 11's crew sat for a formal technical debriefing with NASA staff. That document stayed buried in government files until 2026, when it surfaced as part of a broader declassification of Pentagon UAP records. In it, Buzz Aldrin described spotting a sizable unidentified object near the moon, roughly a day out from lunar orbit, one the crew examined through a monocular and tentatively guessed might be the spent S-4B rocket stage that had separated earlier in the flight. Aldrin separately told debriefers that while trying to sleep with the cabin lights off, he noticed small flashes appearing inside the capsule a couple of minutes apart, a detail he was uncertain occurred on the first night, but confident about on the second. On the return leg to Earth, he reported a distinct bright light source that the crew, unable to identify it, tentatively guessed might have been a laser. The debriefing transcript records the observations. It records no resolution for any of them. Number 2. The moment the planet stopped feeling large. In 1987, researcher Frank White published a book naming a psychological pattern he had documented across dozens of astronaut interviews: the overview effect, a shift in perception reported by people who have seen the whole Earth at once from orbit or from lunar distance. Rusty Schweickart, lunar module pilot on Apollo 9 in March 1969, described watching his sense of identity expand with every 90-minute orbit, moving from his home city to his home country to the entire planet as the spacecraft crossed over each region in turn. Edgar Mitchell, who walked on the moon during Apollo 14 in 1971, described developing an instant and overwhelming awareness of the planet as a single system, paired with a sharp frustration at how small national borders looked from 250,000 miles away.
Michael Collins, who orbited alone above the lunar surface during Apollo 11, used the word fragile to describe Earth from that distance, a description that recurs almost word for word across separate astronauts, separate decades, and separate space agencies, with no coordination between them.
Number 1. Everything behind a thumb. From lunar distance, roughly 384,400 kilometers out, Earth's full 12,742 kilometer diameter shrinks small enough that an outstretched thumb can block it from view entirely. Schweikart described looking at that small blue and white shape and recognizing that every person who had ever lived, every war, every piece of music and art and love and grief in the whole of human history was contained inside that single, obscured point of light. No human being has ever traveled farther from Earth than the Moon. The fastest spacecraft ever launched, the Voyager probes, took roughly 12 hours to cover that same distance decades ago, and are still traveling, having taken over 45 years to exit the solar system's outer edge. The observable universe extends more than 93 billion light-years across, and that is only what human eyes, human instruments, and a handful of declassified files have caught so far. Every flash, every unexplained shape, every debriefing released decades after the fact says less about what's actually out there than about how little of it we've been able to look at directly. Which one of these would have unsettled you the most, sitting in that capsule, watching it happen? Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon, and I'll see you on the next voyage.